Can you tell us about your personal experiences with drugs, how they shape your politics, and how you understand
That is the
overdose?
first question. Okay.
Before we begin, I want to offer a content warning. This episode includes discussion of overdose, drug toxicity, withdrawal, criminalization, grief, and systemic neglect. These topics can be heavy, especially for people who use drugs, people who have lost someone, or people working on the front lines. Please take care of yourself while listening. You can pause, you can step away. Your survival matters. Your survival matters more than finishing an episode. I'm speaking from Hamilton, Ontario, on land covered by the Treaty of Between the Lakes and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I name this because overdose is not separate from colonialism. The drug war is a colonial project, one that relies on surveillance, punishment, displacement, and abandonment. Overdose deaths are not accidents. They are political decisions made inside systems that decide whose lives are worth saving and whose deaths are tolerated. Today I'm joined by Andrzej Celinski, a drug user, organizer, and political advocate with Reclaim Collective and Workers for Ethical Substance Use Policy, also known as WESUP. Andrzej's work directly challenges the way harm reduction in Canada has been professionalized, depoliticized, and stripped of its radical roots. His organizing focuses on drug user liberation, labor rights, and holding governments accountable for policies that continue to produce death. This conversation is not about charity or awareness. It's about power, who has it, who doesn't, and why people who use drugs are still expected to die quietly in cities like Hamilton and Toronto. So thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal experiences with drugs, drug use, how it shapes your politics, especially how you understand overdose, criminalization, and harm reduction?
For sure. So just like for me, I always kind of considered myself a little bit of an outsider. So going back to like my childhood and high school and all that kind of stuff, I always kind of related with kind of the outsiders in school and people who were doing things differently, the weirdos, if you will, and stuff like that was always kind of who I wanted to be around. And that also kind of as it would kind of led to an interest in, folks who were using drugs, folks who were, I guess, I guess just doing something that was contrary to, what people normally do. At least that's how, there was the commercials on TV for, don't do drugs and dare and all that kind of stuff. And like, the way the way it came to me, it almost made it like more of an interesting thing for me to pursue. So there was a little bit of intrigue there. And, it resulted in, me trying, experimenting with things in my life and also being around people like who weren't necessarily, doing things that were always considered normal. So like I had a fascination with drug culture more broadly. As I got older in school, I also had a passion for, issues surrounding social justice and politics and things like that. And eventually, when I was doing my master's degree in school in the Faculty of Environmental Studies, which was really an amazing experience, I really wanted to focus that work around the situation of marginalized groups in urban environments. But I was kind of struggling with, how to capture that, and at the same time, there was also kind of a hesitation on my part to fully embrace all of that identity of my personal identity in that academic setting. So it kind of took me a minute to reconcile the two, but eventually, when I was able to do so with the help of a professor, my major research ended up focusing on the situation of people who use substances and people who are unhoused in urban environments, and looking at why, some jurisdictions like some European jurisdictions have been successful with harm reduction and certain drug policy interventions, and why in Toronto things kind of really haven't worked out as successfully. And a big part of that was incrementalism. How there's a lack of political will to really pursue harm reduction interventions, and social justice interventions that have been quite successful in other jurisdictions. In places like Toronto, it's like it's all half measures, it's small pilot programs, and it's almost like they're kind of built to fail. And you know what? For me, once I got kind of involved in this subject matter, outside of academics and stuff like that, it was kind of really hard to step back from it going back to, my identity growing up and my feeling of being an outsider, or being having friends who were kind of outsiders, that those were the people who were being most impacted by really terrible drug policies. So it was just when the more I got into the work, I had a bunch of kind of not so great jobs. I mentioned I was in environmental studies. I had a job in the environmental sector with a renewable energy company, and there were some great experiences there. But there was also some contradictions in that work, and some hypocrisy in the way kind of things were done that just didn't sit so well with me. And getting more involved in harm reduction and drug user advocacy, I found something where I felt I could really do something meaningful. And not to say that there weren't challenges in that work, but it felt something felt right about being involved doing that kind of work and supporting my community.
And like, was there a moment during all that where you realized that what you were experiencing, it wasn't just like a personal hardship, that there was like a broader connection to like structural violence?
Definitely. And yeah, I think that was, the way my brain works, I think that was always part of the equation. Like my brain kind of, the way I think about things, it's hard for me to not think about it in terms of like the big picture. But I think it's also, I think whenever we're thinking of things in the big picture, it's like you can't always make those big picture changes right away. So it's really important to kind of make, connections to the everyday, into what, you can do right now to help someone. At the same time, those structural things are going to be there. And it really, I feel, it takes, strong relationships and building out community in this work. It's only through like broad coalitions, if you look at history, that really big changes happen. And I think that's what's really needed in this work for us to really push forward, because those that kind of oppose harm reduction and drug policy reform are well funded, are powerful in Canadian politics. And yeah, like it's an uphill battle that we face. So I think it's just hard to, that structural component has always kind of been part of, the way that I view this work, for sure.
Yeah, and like that's a good point too, that a lot of the places that are countering harm reduction are well funded, well organized, for lack of a better word, or like service
Yeah,
providers. What
for
do
sure.
people, like including service providers of harm reduction, get wrong about people who use drugs that kind of causes these issues?
I think there's we have, like I mentioned, like some of those commercials and all that, the education I got about drugs growing up. One of the reasons I personally got curious about drugs was because maybe as I tried marijuana, cannabis, or some hallucinogens or stuff like that in my teenage years, I realized it's like, okay, the things that were telling me that education, drug education, and TV commercials about public service announcements and all that, like the information, the messages, and the data, for lack of a better word, that they're feeding me. It, it's not accurate. Like this wasn't in line with what I was actually experiencing. So it caused me to have a lot of misgivings about you know, trusting these sources for, my information when it came to drugs. And I sought out other sources, whether it be on academia, whether it be on like websites like Blue Light, whether it be on, through networks of folks that I knew, or whether it be like informed by my own experiences. But the unfortunate thing is, not everyone is either invested in this work or has those experiences, or if it's not impacting you on a day-to-day basis, it's easy for there to be some preconceptions or stigma present, right? Like I think it's almost like we need to break down what people have been taught for so long. But doing that's not an easy endeavor. When people are, when a whole generation is raised on bad information, fixing that isn't such an easy thing to do. So I think that's a really big part of it. I'd say I want to be hopeful, but Unfortunately, we've now found ourselves in a situation where social media and various other information sources, whether they be online or from certain politicians, are informing or misinforming folks. So I think we also have a kind of unique battle right now when it comes to getting folks the right information, which is a really important piece of this puzzle.
That's actually very true too. We're living in an age of misinformation, so it's very hard to like we are already dealing with the misinformation that we were being fed when media was just like such a small part of our
Yeah,
world. And now
yeah,
we have an extra layer to kind of peel back on to
yeah.
like to backtrack on. And that kind of leads into the question that I had, like how stigma, surveillance, and punishment show up in the lives of people who use drugs and how that kind of influences policy. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, surveillance hasn't been something that I think folks who use drugs have been able to escape, and it occurs on so many levels. It whether it be folks at OAT or safe supply clinics, being on like camera when they're providing like their urine screenings, whether it be just all the information that's taken as they go through various systems, whether it be the carceral system, whether it be through service providers, all the penalties that surveillance can result in all sorts of negative outcomes for folks, as we were chatting about before, whether it be in their employment, whether it be in their ability to access, certain services that are available, like there's shelters and there's social programs that kind of have that whole like, okay, well, you have to be clean to get this, or abstinent rather. I think using the word clean isn't the best word, but
No, but yeah, I
it's
know
like
what you're talking about.
it's something that it's a framing of this that goes back to like clean was something that was used to describe not using drugs for so long, and just so much, and that just feeds into this idea of that, well, if you're not clean, you're dirty. And there's just so much of that. There's so many perceptions built in to the way that people who use drugs are looked at, and then those perceptions inform a surveillance system where people who use drugs are not second class, but like third class, like citizens. Like, in most workplaces, if someone finds out you use drugs, you could very well lose your job. But there's so much that's on the line.
Very
So much.
true.
There's so like people who use drugs have to hold so much close to the vest, and while trying to counter that whole surveillance apparatus that they have to go up against. So it's a really tricky, difficult situation. And I think harm reduction endeavors to change that dynamic. But as you know, like we're in a really difficult climate when it comes to even talking about harm reduction and people wanting to, care about that in public discourse. And, I think that will change in a few years. I think we're just in a tricky moment right now, but it doesn't bode well for the situation of people who use drugs, and it can result in all kinds of nasty outcomes, as I was saying, and as you know.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, I agree. And we are definitely in like a tricky moment, but I agree that it'll probably pass, or if not, maybe get worse. Like, I feel like we're
Yeah, I hope
dialing
not.
back into like AIDS epidemic era policies and stuff like that. And like the repercussions of that are going to be bad. But I also think this is an era where we can kind of show the testament of our strength and our resilience and our resistance as drug users and organizers. And like this is our moment. Like I feel like harm reduction is such a buzzword now. So it's like
Yeah,
now that harm reduction is being dismantled, essentially, where are all the harm reduction workers now fighting for it in a more satellite or like rogue sense? You know what I mean? But
totally
yeah.
agree.
But from your perspective, what makes overdoses a political thing rather than accidental or inevitable?
Because, well, to me, like in the way that I view them, I never liked the term drug poisoning, or like I know folks had described overdoses as being problematic, a problematic term, and then there were people were calling them drug poisonings and calling them, trying to look for a different language. I find drug poisonings to be problematic because it almost, it like, uh, it's almost saying that these drugs that people are doing are poison. And while in many instances there's things in there that people don't want, like melatonin and xylazine, people aren't really necessarily wanting that in their drug supply. Fentanyl and opioids that people may overdose from aren't inherently dangerous. The dangerous thing is that they're not of
Yeah.
known that they're not of known consistency with respect to the other substances or cutting agents that could be in them. Why it's political because it's due to, like, I look at every drug death as being a policy failure. Instead of calling them overdoses, they should almost be called drug policy deaths, but or
Yeah.
shitty drug
No.
policy
Yeah, for
deaths.
sure.
But
That's
that
actually
just
smart.
doesn't have a great ring to it. But I think that's the reality of it, because the lack of political will to actively address these issues in a meaningful way that embraces evidence, that embraces the academic literature on the topic, the lack to look there, to look at what the Surgeon General, to look at what health officials have said for many years about the need for decriminalization, like legalization, regulation of drugs. The continued willingness to just ignore all that and continue on this prohibitions based path that is obviously not leading anywhere good and resulting in people having a shitty supply and in many instances overdosing and us losing amazing people. It's directly linked to a shitty policy, and there's no other way to put that. You regulate, you go back to alcohol prohibition. When alcohol was prohibited, I think alcohol related poisonings went up like 400 or 600%. There was all types of things, and the potency of the alcohol went up because there's the iron law of prohibition, where things will get more potent and smaller in size as laws to penalize
Yeah.
drugs become stricter. Yeah, I think history has shown that the war on drugs has failed, and people have been saying this for decades now. I can think back to even my youth. There were, ads and folks out there saying the same thing. And it's like, this is a problem that could so easily be solved through thoughtful regulation. And that doesn't mean that we just legalize everything and put it in a convenience store. I think, like, it's really important to look at all drugs as being unique. Coffee and alcohol is not the same, just like cocaine and heroin's not the same, just like as psychedelic LSD and cigarettes aren't the same. All these things are unique and need just doing a blanket decrim or blanket legalization, I don't think is the thoughtful approach. I think part of the problem is that we just lumped there's all these substances that were decided were not worthy of being consumed, were lumped together and called illegal drugs. And it's
Mm-hmm.
really an arbitrary process. I think there needs to be a thoughtful approach that looks at that takes consideration what's happening on the ground, that takes into consideration what this specific substance does, and finds the right way to regulate it and provide it to people so that they can safely consume it and not die and be safe and minimize negative health outcomes. And everybody wins. Society wins by having more productive folks who aren't dealing with health issues because they got an abscess from xylazine and Tkaronto. They win by having someone not be overdosing, who's a family member or who's your
A tax-paying citizen, like,
exactly. Whether society wants to accept it or not, people who use drugs go to work. People who
yeah.
use drugs, are all throughout, coming from every background in society. Ignoring that doesn't get us out of the situation.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point that like, honestly, I've mentioned this in a couple podcast episodes now. I'm pretty sure more, like maybe every single one, but most of the people dying are in private living dwellings, which means they have homes, and they're the employment the the highest number of overdoses by employment is people in construction and trades, which means it's our like
Yeah,
working class men who are dying. So it's
yeah,
not these people on the streets. Like I feel like people have this picturesque idea of like a homeless person who is like a hobo with like somebody in my podcast said this in another episode too, where they have like the red bag on a fucking stick and you know what I mean? It's like that's not what we're dealing with anymore.
it's
That's
so
not
true.
the idea. Like that's not how people are. We're actually dealing with a crisis where like people have dehumanized each other so much that they're being punished for being poor, punished for using drugs, punished for existing in a system where like they're actively being killed. So yeah, it's and like you mentioned like just the policies, they're like bad drug policies. These deaths are caused by bad drug policies. So for cities like Hamilton and Toronto, where you are, we're kind of in like the GTA in the same kind of area, but we've consistently seen high overdose deaths since like 2020. Um, Even when governments claim that they've created some kind of progress or some kind of system to tackle the overdose crisis, what does that tell you about like how like governments frame this crisis?
Incrementalism is the big problem. As I mentioned before, the fact that when governments want to do something, it's like we're expected to be so happy with our with our token, populist gesture that they provide us in the form of I hate to say it, in the form of a few safe consumption sites or in the form of safe supply. While these things are in and of themselves great things in the grand scheme of what governments could actually provide us, it's it's nothing. And in the end, these are not things that they provided us. These are things that people who use drugs fought for and pushed government to allow. Like in Toronto, there was an unsanctioned site put together by activists in the city, and eventually we got some sanctioned sites. Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that people who use drugs got these things, fought for these things, and that's how we got them. But what we got was also so little compared to what is actually needed to properly address this problem. So, if we want to address overdose deaths, we need to have sites, not just 5 sites in the middle in downtown Toronto. We need to have it on the periphery of the city. We need to have them in rural areas. We need to have a safe supply that's actually scaled up to meet the needs of the community in the form of safe supply medications that match the drugs that folks are getting on the street. Unfortunately, Canadian and Dilaudid as safe supply was a little bit too little too late. I
Yeah.
think Canadian Dilaudid would have been more suited to match the supply when heroin was the opioid that was predominantly being used. Whereas, and Oxycontin was, heroin and Oxycontin, were much more prominent, up to maybe by 2017, 2020, it was all fentanyl, and then
Yeah.
fentanyl with benzos, and then fentanyl with all kinds of other stuff. So I think it's like we never got what was required to match the situation. So I think that's where policymakers and government has really fallen short. And as quickly as they provide it, they take it away as well,
Mhm.
right? Which is also very dangerous. People get used to some semblance of stability with their safe supply, getting their drugs tested, getting harm reduction supplies, with getting, wraparound services through a
Mhm.
service
With have
provider,
somewhere to go to use and
with
be
having a
looked
safe
over,
supply.
like
Exactly. And then it's taken away. It's very harmful to the community and it breaks trust as well, right?
mhm.
So, yeah, it's not good, unfortunately, what's happening now. But, as you mentioned earlier, I hope that that the folks who really care about this, about harm reduction and about the community, come together. And I've seen a lot of that happening. So, I'm still optimistic.
Yeah, no, me too. Speaking of optimism and stuff like that, let's talk about Reclaim. Like, what is Reclaim Collective, and what did you guys really like form to address?
Okay, well, Reclaim. So it was me, myself, and a few of my colleagues, and basically, it's folks that I met. I was working in the nonprofit sector and drug user organizing for a few years, and had some amazing experiences, but also had some challenges, and kind of. Coming out of that, realized that a big part of empowering myself and empowering ourselves is controlling our labor. So for people that lived in living experience, control over our labor is uh, is not just about better wages and job titles. It's about providing us with a level of self-determination. And in so many instances, in doing this kind of work or being involved in research projects or in various ways that people involved in harm reduction or peer work or drug user organizing. Often we kind of get like at times tokenistic roles. I don't want to say that's always the case, but a lot of times that may be the case. And our knowledge, and it feels like our knowledge is extracted without our consent, valued, or framed as participation rather than expertise. We're invited into rooms, panels, and projects, but really given control over how our labor is defined,
Absolutely.
compensated, timed, or used. And this isn't accidental. When institutions control our labor, they control narratives, priorities, and outcomes. So Reclaim Collective was about coming together to take control over labor as a means of refusing extractive models that treat our lived experiences as a resource to be and asserting that our time, emotional labor, intellectual work, and community relationships have real value, and that value must be defined by us, not by the systems that historically harmed us. So, and I've seen so many examples of people with lived experience coming together and taking control over their labor in all sorts of different situations, and it can be, and really amazing things can happen. Power can move from the institutions to communities. Knowledge flows horizontally instead of being filtered through experts without lived experience. Accountability increases because we're no longer dependent on gatekeepers for legitimacy or survival. And care becomes possible as we can set boundaries that protect our health, safety, and autonomy. So for Reclaim Collective, controlling our labor is a political act. It allows us to decide when we engage, how we engage, and on what terms. It means choosing collaboration over tokenism, fair compensation over exposure, and collective decision-making over top-down control. And this is not about exclusion. It's about equity. It's about correcting power imbalances that have long positioned people with lived experiences as informants rather than leaders. Control over our labor is control over our direction too. So at Reclaim, we get to choose the projects we want to do and what we don't want to do. And for people with lived experience, that control is essential to building systems that do not reproduce harm, but instead reflect our realities, priorities, and visions for care. It's really great having a group of people that I meet with every week to discuss projects I really care about and to be around people that I truly love and trust. So yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, it's like a meeting of the minds, basically. Like so many different people, different walks of life, but kind of like a similar thing that they connect on, a similar passion, I guess. And yeah,
Yeah.
it definitely, you guys like talk explicitly about liberation a lot, not just survival. What does liberation mean to you as like a person who used drugs or like just somebody involved in drug user world?
Yeah, well, it's in line with some of the things that I mentioned. It's about me and the people and people who really matter to me. I'm able to work with those people and do things that I really enjoy doing and that I also feel make a difference. That in itself for me has been so liberating. It sucks to be, you know, in an organization and be stifled either by leadership that isn't taking you in the direction that you feel is what's best for the organization, whether there's infighting going on, whether, and there's always going to be obstacles, whether it's around, funding or, it's a really difficult, kind of minefield right now for folks doing harm reduction. Or, you feel a need to kind of, be careful or reframe things. But I think, you know, having my own kind of thing within Reclaim with people I care about. And when we bring in, we also do a bunch of mutual aid where we bring in folks, outside of Reclaim to join us in various projects, and that, and again, that's really empowering to just have that choice that in so many instances for, those employed as maybe a peer or in a more of a top-down organizational structure, you don't feel like you always have that power or that control over what's
Yeah.
going on,
You don't
and it
really
really
get a
sucks.
choice.
And it really sucks because, like, for all four of us, at Reclaim, all four of us as co-founders, at least of Reclaim, it feels we all had kind of a background in this work where we had some ups and downs, and we felt like we needed to do something different, and we kind of saw a gap in terms of a group like of all kind of lived experience folks like we are, coming together and trying to reclaim our labor in a way that, we work with researchers. I feel like we're all like, professionals in this work. And we're not hiding from what we are, but we're also willing to embrace new ideas, and we're just trying to do things differently in a way that works for us. And yeah, it's a powerful thing.
Yeah, no, for sure. And thank you for that, like honesty. And I remember you wanted to talk to me about like the drug, like the toxic drug supply in Toronto, and like the
Yeah,
growing reports of methamphetamine and like the
yeah,
veterinary tranquilizers, things like that appearing in the drug supply, and how like this isn't just a chemistry issue, it's a policy issue with life or death consequences. So for listeners hearing this for the first time, what is methamphetamine and how does it act in the body? Do you know about that kind of stuff?
yeah. So what it is it's a veterinary tranquilizer that's not actually approved for human consumption. According to the drug testing services in Toronto, I think they do a month by month report. It's in 80% of the fentanyl in Toronto right now. And it's a really scary thing. We had xylazine that was also a veterinary tranquilizer, not approved for, human use, that was, causing some serious wounds. And that would also cause, a withdrawal of its own. And, that could be quite dangerous. That could lead to, irregular heartbeats and, tremors and potentially death. And, for the most part, opioid withdrawal doesn't lead to death, except in situations where there's some type of comorbidity. But with these tranquilizers, the way that they affect the heart, and metatonin now being so prevalent in the supply, I think it's a real signal of how scary things are getting. People are not consenting. People aren't wanting to take when the drugs changed from heroin to fentanyl, people didn't consent to that. It was done to them, and it's a direct result again of that shitty drug policy. And there's the power to control the drug supply is put, is in the hands of organized crime, who then, determines what's in the drugs, and the drug users themselves, have very little say in the matter. So, and now with metatonin, the withdrawal from it can lead to someone actually dying. Like their heart can start racing so rapidly that they have tachycardia and they have a heart attack and pass away, and they need to be taken to a hospital immediately, because there's some medications like that are available by prescription, like clonidine. If someone maybe hasn't been taking the metatonin as frequently, and maybe they can at home take some clonidine and get through it themselves. But in a lot of instances, because this is so prevalent in the drug supply, if they've been taking it for throughout the day for a month or a few months, stopping it rapidly without weaning down, or getting some medical assistance, or without the help of clonidine or anything like that, it can be really, really dangerous. And
Yeah, absolutely.
and another serious symptom of withdrawal is like extreme vomiting, right? So you might not even be able to take that clonidine down. I know that there's an antidote for metatonin overdoses that's, I believe, available in that's only available in ERs, because the antidote, I believe, in and of itself can also. It's not like naloxone, where it's just like benign, like in terms of like you give someone naloxone, you're not going to hurt them,
Yeah.
even if they're overdosing or not overdosing. And then there's also something that can be given in ERs to help with with the withdrawal symptoms, that's given only by IV in the ERs. There's not a lot of great options for folks when it comes to like navigating this. And I just find this is just another really terrible outcome of this kind of ongoing war on drugs, where folks on the ground, aren't consenting to what's going on, but are being really seriously impacted, on so many levels. And I think when it comes to drug withdrawal, we don't talk about it, doesn't get talked about enough, and on so many levels. Just in the broader conversation about harm reduction, we're talking about overdoses, which are serious, but withdrawal, is what's affecting people on a day-to-day basis. It's what's affecting quality of life. It's the a big reason why people are going to go use day in and day out to keep withdrawals at bay. It's going to make someone potentially miss work, you know run out of the house to go score, rather than wanting to being able to be with their family, or do all sorts of other things. It doesn't get talked about enough in terms of the just the discomfort of it, but there's also, of course, like now, like um, serious, like life-threatening realities that are associated with this evolving drug supply. And the unfortunate truth, in my mind, is that it's just going to get worse. Like I don't see things getting better, and the current harm reduction landscape, in terms of what's available for folks in terms of drug testing strips for metonamine, and things like that. They're available primarily at a few like downtown locations in Toronto, but yeah, just people don't have access, or even may not even know that this is in their drug supply. So it's a really difficult situation. Yeah, I think that there just needs to be more awareness about these things.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you touched on it briefly, but like just talking about how this is like a direct impact of policy or direct result of bad drug policy. But like, could you kind of go into that more? Like, why do you think we're seeing substances enter the supply now? Like, especially just like post COVID and like post like harm reduction resources shutting down. Like, do you think that has anything to do with it?
Hey, well, my thinking on this is why some of the reasons why I think substances are coming into the drug supply now with fentanyl, when this happened, back when heroin was, the predominant opioid in the streets. Sure, there was the odd time where there would be benzodiazepines in the supply, but I think it was more of an exception rather than a norm. The big difference is, when folks do use heroin, there's a real kind of, especially by IV, there's a real rush associated with it. By the time they start using fentanyl, now heroin's no longer going to work for them. One. Number two, there isn't that same rush associated with it, and the tolerance is built up much more quickly. So folks, it's almost like when they're using fentanyl day in day out, despite what they might what the media or whatever would have you believe, fentanyl, it's just making people well day in day out, and it's not really getting them high. And I think uh, this is more so the case than it was with heroin. I think, folks were able to kind of, like obviously, the longer you use, the kind of less you're going to feel it. But I think this is greater with fentanyl, and also with fentanyl's short duration and things like that. People are just kind of start trying to keep well, but yeah, but people are paying money for these drugs, and they still want to get high. And I think part of it is that people are putting dealers or organized crime are putting things in the drug supply to convince people they're still getting high. And then also, it's like if you're not getting high on the drug, it's like more of an incentive to go on OAT, go on safe supply, to try to find a way out, even if there aren't that many good ways out. People are more incentivized to be like, what am I doing? I'm just getting by, right? So I think that that's another reason why these things are in the supply. That's to keep people using, right? you know,
Supply and demand.
yeah, exactly. We don't have, you know, a regulated market for this thing, which is crazy in my mind. Like, I don't see how having an unregulated market is the preferable kind of status quo, but that's
Hmm.
where it's at. So,
Yeah.
there's no control over what's being added to it, and I think it's going to get worse until government steps in or is pushed, by activism and by people civil disobedience.
Yeah, I
And
was about to say, historically, like what do you think, what forms of resistance would actually force change to happen, even if they're labeled as illegal or extreme? Like what has historically worked for changing laws?
well, I think civil disobedience for sure, but it's what Delph was doing, I think, was really brave and amazing. Like rebellion, rebellious acts and in form of civil disobedience that I think in many ways was effectively pushing back on kind of the status quo and they were seeing their friends dying and they did something about it at great risk to themselves. And also knowing that when this eventually did go through the court system, that it could force some type of change to the laws. So while that's very effective, I think that giving out, doing a compassion club, for heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, giving that out at rallies and stuff like that, I think that has a really positive impact on the community in terms of the drug using community and activists. It really kind of invigorates folks. And I think folks in Canada really cared, who were involved in this work, really cared deeply for Dolph. It also created a pushback, at great risk to Eris and Jeremy. So, it's hard. And I think I know I really feel that safe consumption sites are really a crucial, part of the solution to all this. At the same time, they're also just kind of one piece of the puzzle. I think we need to kind of be working at this on all fronts. But
I
yeah,
completely agree.
there's certainly risks involved.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely risk involved, and yeah, the resistance. I guess the resistance inherently breeds risk, is like the point that you're trying to make there. Do you think
Yeah,
if people who use drugs were actually in charge of policy, what do you think would change immediately?
well, I think there would be funding for programs that would be helping our community. And I think that there would be an effort to find ways to, regulate this stuff effectively. I think, we need some sort of a legalization of all substances. I don't think that any of these things should be criminalized, but I also think, decrim on its own, I don't think is well suited for drugs, as we're still relying on an unregulated market. I think these things need to be regulated, but I think we need to look at all sorts of models for how to provide how drugs are provided to community, whether some of them are medically based models, community based models. And I think I think it would the most effective thing would be some combination of both. But again, it would depend on each substance. I think some substances you could, maybe hallucinogens, things in that category, you could sell in a store, like much like you sell cannabis. But I think for
Hmm.
some of the other substances, there would have to be like a more thoughtful approach. And I think what Dolph was doing was a great model in terms of providing substances to communities. So having the drugs tested. There's also a doctor, Sutherland in British Columbia, who's providing fentanyl capsules at a cost that's equivalent to the street value, so it's not resold,
Mm.
and is effectively providing that to our patients. I see both like a healthcare based model and a community based model, like
Yeah.
being part of the solution.
Yeah, and I think that's really cool. Like that there's so many different ways that we could like they'd like to they being like the broader society who thinks about this issue likes to think there's only like one path to go, but there's so many different areas of expertise that come together to fight this issue, which means there's so many different paths that we could take to
Yeah,
find the end of this like prohibition
agreed.
era war on drugs. And like all of them coming together would be exactly, I would agree, like the final say or like the real key to solving this issue. But we're gonna like do like a closing reflection because honestly, we answered so many of those questions, and I'm sure you're tired. I'm tired. So for the last
Okay.
thing, yeah, I got you, dude. For people who use drugs listening right now, especially those who are scared, exhausted, or dealing with new risks in the supply, what do you want them to know?
I think that you're not alone. And I think it's really important that we find each other and build connections. I think part of why, quote unquote, they're winning in, especially in this difficult times right now, is that, we have been in many instances successfully divided. And in those examples where folks have come together, whether it's, be it Van Duyn or in Dolphin, British Columbia, or whether it be the Overdose Prevention Society in Toronto, when we come together, we can make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. That was beautiful. Yeah. So, just as an end, I just want to speak directly to people who use drugs as well, especially anybody listening who is like trying to survive this increasingly toxic supply as well. None of what you're facing is your fault, not the overdoses, not the withdrawals, not the grief. You're not disposable and you're not a policy failure. You're not just a statistic waiting to happen. What's happening right now in Hamilton, in Toronto, and across Ontario, across this country is not inevitable. It's a result of deliberate choices to criminalize instead of caring, to police instead of provide, and to manage death instead of preventing it. So solidarity in this moment is not a charity. It's believing people who use drugs, and it's funding and following drug user-led organizing. So if this conversation brought things up for you, you don't have to carry that alone. Reach out to somebody you trust, take a break, drink some water. You deserve gentleness even when we fight. So thanks, Andre.